Hello, my name is Michaela O'Connor Abrams, founder of Mocha Plus. Welcome to our Collective Conscience series. We created this series for you to bring together great minds from around the world on myriad topics that we hope will expand your mind, will challenge your current beliefs, and give you an opportunity to be inspired with every video. Enjoy.
Good evening and welcome to Collective Conscience on Zoom. I'm Shelley Tatum Kieran, partner at Mocha Plus, and we are thrilled to have all of you with us for this conversation this evening with Bruce Mao. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Michaela.
Thank you, Shelley. Welcome everyone to part 3 of our series with Bruce Mao. I've been asked the question a lot in the last week after seeing the invitation. Well, I really want to be a part of this, but I'm afraid that if I missed one and or two, that I'm going to be lost. And I hope I have assured each of you that that is not the case, that this in and of itself is going to be a really wonderful discussion and presentation in the beginning, as Bruce does, to give this a very clear context, because there is no more important time than the times in which we are living that this principle plays a part. I want to also just remind everybody, if this is your first time, that part of what spurred this discussion is his new book, MC24, which stands for the Principles of Massive Change. And I don't get paid to say this. I highly recommend getting this book. I now have 3 copies because I keep letting people borrow it. He has done an incredible interview on Saturday, actually, with the Design Museum and Tim Marlowe, the CEO and executive director. And I thought this was brilliant. Tim called it in his interview with Bruce that this is the intellectual self-help book for the planet. And I think that you will see, even in just the exploration of this principle, how true that is in dealing with everything going on in our lives today. So Bruce, thank you so much again for joining us. It really is a pleasure, and I appreciate it. Shelley and I do more than you can imagine, and I will make sure to try and win the group award for buying the most books and giving them.
Thank you, Michaela.
Thank you.
So today we're going to look at the second principle, begin with fact-based optimism. And I think that, you know, at least I don't remember a more challenging time for this principle, you know, to kind of find the optimism in the chaos and the madness that's swirling around us. But that's really what designers do. I mean, that is our responsibility. And so I want to really dig into this and kind of go through it in order. So in my case, you know, someone asked me recently why I'm optimistic, and I said, you know, part of it I think is that I had a pretty rough start. I grew up on a farm outside of a mining town in northern Canada. It was, you know, minus 40 in the winters. We didn't have running water. So my job as a young man was to go to the well in the valley and provide water to the family. And so every day that I turn on the tap and the water comes out, it's like, hallelujah. What an incredible thing that you just have clean water when you need it. And you realize that, you know, it's that not having that is something that I share with about 1 billion people. And so we're still, you know, we've still got a long way to go to really make this possible. But I think part of that is, you know, part of my optimism is that experience that, you know, when I eventually kind of went out into the world, you know, I consider myself one of the most fortunate designers of the last half century. And so I've just really experienced the optimism of the world. And I think the second big impact on that was doing massive change, where we met, you know, a few hundred of the people who are taking on the most vexing challenges in human history. You know, we met the people who took smallpox off the face of the earth. And and that's a disease that killed 500 million people in the last century. So, when you meet those people, it really, you have a kind of exposure to the possibility of humanity in a way that's hard to match. So, I like to think that as designers, we have no choice but to be optimistic. We don't have we don't have the option of being pessimistic. And even though our media shows us a kind of image of the world that is really organized around violence and conflict, the true story of our time is living together and caring for one another. That the big kind of story of our time in the long sweep of history will be that we collaborated across boundaries and barriers and borders and across religions, languages. You think about what is happening today in response to the pandemic, that there are over 100 design teams working right now on creating a vaccine. And they are all kind of exploring it in their own way and trying to get to that goal as quickly as possible. So, I think it's really important to kind of take the long view and see what's really going on in the big picture, knowing that the kind of more contemporary look might be problematic. In fact, more people are wealthier, healthier, and living longer, traveling, connecting, and learning from other cultures across boundaries and borders, and really experiencing the beauty of our world than at any time in human history. And not by a slight margin, really by a radical long shot. The kind of global access to possibility has never been greater. Now, that doesn't mean that we're not, beset with trouble and challenges, but it's important to kind of put them in context. The reality is that there's no better time to be alive. I had dinner some time ago, actually after an event with Michaela, with a classicist in Los Angeles, and I said, tell me another. I asked him, tell me another time that you would rather be alive, and he said, oh, there are lots of times. And I said, well, not as a royal, but really as a common citizen. And by the end of the dinner, he acknowledged, in fact, you're absolutely right. There is no better time for most people, and that is, again, not for everyone. And millions and millions of people are working on that problem to make that access as comprehensive as possible. But it's really critical, if we're going to do that, to embrace the optimism that got us here. The way that we solved all those problems was by applying optimism, that we believed we could. Otherwise, we would have given up long ago. So that's really the kind of gist of this principle, that our responsibility as designers is to be optimistic, but not in a Pollyanna kind of stupid way, but really in a fact-based, informed way. And that's such an important piece of that phrase, fact-based, begin with fact-based optimism. So I wanted to share this project by Max Roser from the World in Data. It's really one of my favorite discoveries. What Max Roser did was he imagined a world over the last 200 years represented by 100 people. So what would 100 people over all those years look like according to these most important metrics? And what you see in every graph, just in some cases more clear than others, but all going in the same direction, is a positive inversion. In other words, if you look at extreme poverty, 200 years ago, only 6 people were not living in extreme poverty. Only 6 out of those 100 people, representing all mankind, were not living in extreme poverty. Today, it's only 10 are living in extreme poverty. And when I say only 10, it's still a huge number, 10%. But again, you can see which direction that line is moving. I mean, it's really stunning how consistently and smoothly that line has moved. And similarly with basic education, 200 years ago, 83 had not attained any education. 17 have basic education or more. Today, only 14 do not. And again, that kind of positive inversion is really critical. And we are working steadily, including Bruce Mau's studio, on that problem to say, how do we reach more and more people with the promise and power of education? Similarly with literacy, child mortality, vaccination, you see for most of that time, there was nothing. And now, we're able to really get better and better coverage and, liberate more and more people from the kind of plague that we face. So I like to say we cannot afford the luxury of cynicism. Cynicism is for others. If you're a designer, it's for somebody else. Your job is optimism. And it's not that cynicism or kind of stone throwing doesn't have a place in the ecosystem of change. But it's not the place that designers have. Our job is not to throw stones. Our job is to actually solve those problems that people aren't throwing stones about. So we begin with the premise that we have no choice but to be optimistic. Pessimism closes the mind. You think about it, what happens when we're pessimistic? We don't need to act because nothing can change. Nothing will be solved. It's only through optimism that opportunity becomes visible. Pessimism is easy, optimism is hard. It sounds like the opposite. I often hear people, and I've been accused of irrational optimism, that it's somehow kind of, silly or simple-minded to be optimistic. But in fact, it's much simpler to be pessimistic. Being optimistic is really complex because you have to actually think about how to solve things and look for the opportunity where none seems evident. So in the end, optimism challenges us to action. If you think about, if you're optimistic, you have to do something about it. Pessimism really lets you off the hook. You can just, complain and do nothing and watch the world go to the dogs. But an optimist actually is really obliged to step in. And we have to roll up our sleeves and make a difference. Design is optimism in action. It's really the kind of methodology of optimism. I like to say that designers are first responders without the call to physical courage, because we run towards the problem and we look for the most difficult things because those are the greatest opportunities. And the challenges we face today are the greatest opportunities in human history. And by the way, those were produced by design and they must be solved by design. The challenges we face, we call success problems. Because we succeeded in so many things, we're now, in solving so many problems, we're now approaching 8 billion, and then 9 and 10. And at those kinds of numbers, all the problems that we face are really as a function of that quantity. And that means a new higher order complexity of problem. So we created the problems that we have to solve, and we will solve them by applying design. Now, the critical dimension of this is analysis. And analysis for a designer is both scientific and intuitive. And it's a really important distinction because a lot of scientists, well, even scientists, let's say a lot of scientists will start with pure quantitative analysis. But I think scientists share a kind of intuitive leap. In other words, they discover things in the data. They discover things that they see the pattern that other people don't see. And that combination of counting the dots and connecting the dots is really what fact-based optimism is all about. So when you connect the dots, you're sort of forming the pattern. You're defining the pattern in the data. What I find really important is not to do that too quickly, nor to leave it too late. In other words, I like to design immediately, even when we have very little data, because not knowing is a very precious opportunity at the beginning of a project that allows you to think about things without knowing why they wouldn't work. And that kind of freedom of mind is a really critical asset in the course of a design effort. You know, I remember one time I was with my wife, B.C. Williams, in our car in Toronto. It was very cold out, and we were on our way to the studio, and we heard a report about the AIDS epidemic in Africa and how terrible it was. And the person who was being interviewed was talking about how no one was doing anything, and that was kind of their line. BC got quite upset about that. I said, I would be upset too if it were true. But the reality is that today, this moment, there are millions of people going to work on this problem. There are millions of people all over the world forming teams, addressing the problem, trying to figure out how are we going to confront the AIDS challenge. And I said, if we published a newspaper called Reality, that newspaper would be a mile thick. And the first quarter inch is the New York Times, and it scares the living daylights out of you. The rest of the mile is massive change. The rest of the mile is collaboration, cooperation, people getting together and solving problems that in some cases have vexed us since the beginning of time. What you have to acknowledge is that the media, the news media, are incessantly focused on violence and conflict, not because they're bad people or they have a kind of, some kind of agenda. It's that violence and conflict fits the format. The format is drama. Violence and conflict are perfect for drama. Cooperation, not so much. The reality of our world is cooperation. That's the dominant reality of our time. So we have to be really careful not to see what we think of as the news as reality. It's an important piece of reality, but it's really important to really see the big picture and understand the long term, because that's really the kind of critical piece of information that allows you to find opportunity. And this quotation by Wangari Maathai, I just really love it, and I kind of used it today in my post on LinkedIn. In the course of history, there comes a time when humanity is called to shift to a new level of consciousness, to reach a higher moral ground, a time when we have to shed our fear and give hope to each other. That time is now. And I should say that Wangari Maathai was, and she's the first African woman to win the Nobel Prize. She led the green movement in Africa and planted over 50 million trees. So you can see, just how we can actually collaborate, cooperate, and have the kind of impact that we want. Fact-based optimism is not utopian. It's really, again, another really important idea that the charge of utopianism is a powerful way to shut down optimism, because utopian is by definition out of reach. it is, it's a vision that is unreachable. When in fact, fact-based optimism is really applying analysis and defining the opportunity. So it really is critical that we kind of dodge the utopian bullet in order to establish that we're in this for the long haul to make real change. That fact-based optimism anticipates an accelerating cycle of progress and problems. One name for the cycle is massive change. To manage it requires an endless pursuit of better solutions, the tireless work of design. So what we're really doing in design globally is pushing our design process to a higher order of complexity in order to really understand and tackle the new order complexity challenges that we're facing. One of the things that I think is one of the most tragic cultural effects of my lifetime is the conflation of critical and cynical. In other words, we think critical is negative. We think being critical is being negative and being serious. So even in the cultural practices, we kind of attribute criticality to negative or cynical work, when in fact, critical is neutral. The kind of definition of critical is I'm going to do an analysis from a neutral standpoint, from a neutral position, and really calculate the situation, calculate the circumstances. Critical is not a negative stance. And I think this kind of idea has permeated even the creative practices, where it seems smarter to be negative, when in fact what we need is positive. It's absolutely critical that we produce positive solutions. And what we see is that cynical is passive to destructive. So you're either I don't care to this is terrible. Critical is active to productive. So it's really saying, look, let's look at things. And when we look at things systematically and from a neutral standpoint, we can see the possibility. So that, for me, is one of the most important kind of ideas that we need to take on board. So I just want to end with a project called Too Perfect. It's a project that I did in Denmark. And the Danish Architecture Center called me and said, we'd like your help in shaking us out of our Danish modern. That today in Denmark, if a young designer makes a product that doesn't look Danish, that doesn't look classically Danish modern, it's considered unpatriotic. And so a whole generation of designers are kind of kept under by this inability to think about the future in a new way. And so we designed the project as a series of open letters that started Dear Denmark. And we said, look, if you go back to the 40s in Denmark, what you saw was a group of young Danish designers and architects creating a new world, creating a future. And it was messy, and it was unsightly at times. In fact, one of the now Danish kind of landmarks, cultural landmarks, is the SAS Hotel. When it opened, there was a 2-inch headline in the Danish paper, the ugliest building in the world. And it's now considered one of the classics of Danish modernism. And so I said, look, if we're going to think about the future of Denmark in an open way, we have to liberate ourselves from the kind of past constraints. And so we commissioned 7 different firms, 7 different architects to kind of explore that idea. This is a project by Bjarke Engels and Julian de Smet when they were partners. And it's a new concept for Denmark with an energy bill of 0. And if you take that kind of insight, what would it take to, what if Denmark had an energy bill of 0? To do that, you would completely redesign everything that you do. Your cities would look very, very different than they do today. And this was the kind of first sketch prototype. And this became, it looks absolutely radical. One can't imagine Copenhagen looking like this. But since that time, these buildings are being built in Copenhagen. Bjarke has actually built buildings that look very much like this, that really operate on the principles that were first set out in this project. And this is another project that was part of the show. And it was, what if Denmark was the housing factory of the world? And what they showed was that, while the airplane has been completely reimagined, the car, the typewriter, the telephone, over the last 100 years, the house is still the house. And we don't take advantage of the technologies and the manufacturing capacities or any of the kind of possibilities that we could if we opened our mind to a new way of living and working. So I want to end my comments with this concept that the most powerful critique ultimately is designing a better way. That's really the most critical thing that we can do. So I will stop sharing now and open the discussion.
Okay. That, I don't know about anybody else, but I feel like it's a masterclass, Bruce. I could, and I've had the privilege of being at your sessions many times, and I never tire of hearing it. And then as you're talking, I'm thinking about ideas and ways to use it myself. So to that end, you have several actually designers and architects tonight on the salon, but many who are not. And so for those people for whom designing and being, having fact-based optimism is perhaps an avocation, right? Not a vocation. Mm-hmm. What are some of the things practically that that you can share with them about using this principle for themselves? Where would they start tomorrow morning to feel better about things? What are some tangible things they can do?
So first of all, we're all designers. We're all designing our homes, our lives, our careers, our workplace. We're all designers now. So I think we're all in this together. And more and more, it's evident just how in it together we are, as we're all suffering at the moment. So if you think about this as a kind of simple methodology, fact-based optimism, the real kind of challenge then is, how do I maintain both of those? So how do I sustain a kind of gathering of the facts? And it's really critical to get the information, to get the data, to get access to information about what you're trying to do, what it looks like elsewhere, what other people have done. It's really a kind of analysis piece that is about getting the information, so that that will inform your decision making. And then the second piece is to kill cynicism. I'm allergic to it. If I see it, I kill it. So, it happens to the best of us. And I just have no patience for it. I really have to go after it because it is a threat to our survival. Right? It's a threat on a fundamental level to who we are and what we do. And so we cannot be passive or lackadaisical about it. We have to take a constant vigilance around cynicism, because it really is it is a kind of infection of its own, and it can really color what becomes possible. And I have a friend in Brazil who did her PhD on the relationship between imagination and technology. You know, like how what we ultimately build comes from what we imagine. And she shows that, in fact, a lot of the things that become technologies were first imagined in science fiction and movies and, you know, cartoons and comics. And she shows an example of the first jetpack ever created and the first image of a person with the jetpack. And in the first image, the person flying the jetpack has a red jumpsuit with a white stripe and a white helmet. And the first real jetpack picture, the person flying it is in a red jumpsuit with a white stripe and a white helmet. I mean, it's really uncanny. So that concept, it's actually someone who at MIT who said that, you know, technology catches up to imagination. Right? So our imagination is out in front, imagining a positive world. If we're not, I'm quite fearful of this problem. If we're imagining a dystopian world, what is our technology going to look like? Right? What are the, you know, what's that going to be, you know, what are we going to live like if all of our imagination is dedicated to dystopia?
Well, you talk about the media, right? That they're not bad people, but they are programmed, incentivized to cleave to the drama, yeah, to the most sensational, to the worst possible news because it sells. You know, whole thing, right? Bad news sells, no matter what the news is. The truth of the matter is, much like you just framed the whole design profession and actually democratizing it and saying we're all designers, really, of our lives and the greater world. The truth of the matter is we're all publishers anymore. That's what technology has allowed us to do. We are information seekers and gatherers, and yes, even distributors. Yeah. So I'd be interested in your thought about, I mean, what could we fundamentally do with each of our voices collectively to find a way to change, and by that I mean, therefore, it means having to change the lens from the one to many, the millions, from the drama, right? Yeah. To, I mean, that to me is a big design problem.
Yeah, and I think that there are, you know, my wife, B.C. Williams, talks about do one thing. And I think it's such a brilliant concept to just do one thing. You know, you don't have to reorder your entire existence. Do one thing that moves the ball forward, you know, that moves things forward, that moves your life forward. Do one thing. It's really powerful as a kind of way of cutting through the kind of mess that we're in. Because I think that when we look at that mess, we're paralyzed with complexity. We just think, how can I possibly contribute to this? Right. But in fact, we all can. And we can in ways like unimaginable just a couple decades ago, that we can contribute to movements. We can, you know, like if you want to do one thing, you have a lot of options, and they're very accessible in a way that they've never been in human history. Right. I mean, you can start today to, you know, vote for something that really is important, to contribute to something that really is important, to do one thing that really makes a difference.
Well, and you, in the book, obviously, and in the slides that you just went over with us, and that comes from that chapter and that principle, you give examples about, you know, the whole idea that the planet really has gotten better. I mean, there's so much to talk about in progress. If we could put our lens on that and then be more clear in not being paralyzed about everything happening that is negative, but to really say, wait a minute. And I think this is really true for this time. The people who feel like, you know, we're going to be okay, we're going to get through this, often get called Pollyanna, and you just obviously have numbed yourself, don't know what you're drinking, but you don't get how bad it is. And I think that's more people need to be allergic to cynicism like you are, because I think that's going to make the most sense. And there are many influential people who are trying to control the dialogue with fear. And so we know that. We know what happens because we have hundreds of years of history about influential people in leadership positions who spread fear in order to control people. So we have the power not to succumb to that, especially in a digital world.
Yeah, there's a beautiful quotation in this chapter that I didn't highlight it, but it was in the slides, and it's by Paul Hawken. And Paul Hawken says, paraphrasing, if you look at the science and you're not pessimistic, you don't understand the data. But if you look at the people and what they're doing and you're not optimistic, you haven't got a pulse. And I thought, what a beautiful way of putting it. It's like, yeah, we've never had the firestorm of problems that we're now facing. And it's going to get worse. I mean, the reality is that there's more coming. But we've also never had the tools and the capacity that we now have, and the possibility that we now have, if we keep our wits about us and really maintain optimism and really do the work that we need to do.
Yeah. One of the questions that has come up from the community is, what about our educational system and the design of that and what it's producing? And, what's your feeling on this?
Well, everything that we're proposing is based on universal access to education. So universal access to education is essential to our success. We have to bet on everyone. We have to really acknowledge that we can't possibly know who is going to contribute the most. When you look at, if you looked at a picture of me, working as a rink rat in my hometown, there's no way you would have picked me out of that line and said, that guy is going to be, designing Mecca. I mean, if you had told me that, I would have said, you're crazy. And I think that, I fortunately came along at a time when our country, in Canada, we bet on everyone. And we made access to university, higher education, really universally accessible. And I'm a product of that bet. And so, if we're going to get the impact of the double-double, of the power double-double, we need the exponential increase in capacity that we're producing. But to access it and to really make the most of it, we need the universal access to education, so that geniuses around the world who are currently in hiding will be revealed and help us get through this time. Like, I like to say that Einsteins are evenly distributed. It's like one country doesn't have more than the other, but one country might have better access to Einsteins.
Well, in addition, though, let me just posit that other than in some of our best design schools, in the world, but let's just even take this country. Other than that, are you really confident in the curriculum and the offering and in a much more progressive way that educators and our university systems are bringing this kind of thinking and the curriculum to people who are the geniuses?
No, our system in America is based on exclusivity. So our ideal format is as few people as possible. That's how it's designed. Now, there are people like Michael Crow at ASU going in the absolute opposite direction. And I started working with Michael, I think about 13 years ago. to really design a university that has access and excellence. That concept is not a trade-off. That trade-off is false. That we can have excellence and access, and it is absolutely essential to our success that we reconceive the format, that we reconceive, how we deliver education. And one of the few gifts of the pandemic is that it's forcing us to do that.
Yeah. I was just going to say, I think, granted, I mean, the first place everyone went was, okay, well, Zoom classrooms. And then we had a number of places, it's teachers saying, I won't teach by Zoom. And then those that did actually made it the parents' problem, and never, ever thought of reimagining a curriculum. I don't care if it's for first grade, 8th grade, or college, that would just say, okay, somebody dumped the marbles outside the jar. That doesn't mean we're going to try and put them back the way they were in order to say we did it and we taught you something. So that's kind of the optimism, speaking of that I'm talking about, is really making sure that we challenge the educators, that the access is critical, but then once we have that access, to make sure that what the offering is valuable enough to spur the next generation of thinkers. And I'm not pessimistic about it, and God knows I'm not a cynic or you'd want to kill me. So, but I don't see a lot of it. We're going to.
This is a real problem that you don't see it, because a few days ago I watched Michael Crow give a presentation to 25,000 digital educational entrepreneurs and innovators around the world. Right? That story is not in the news tonight. It's like we're not hearing about it.
Right.
But that's really what's going on. I mean, there is a movement that is happening to change that problem, to fix that problem. And I think, we're working on it ourselves at Bruce Mount Studio, and I'm hopeful that we will not produce another educational monoculture, because I think we're we see that the monoculture that we have doesn't work. Right? It's really a factory system from the industrial age, but we're somehow desperate for a new monoculture, that we want a solution, instead of acknowledging that, in fact, what we need is a complex ecology of education. We need an education that really is designed around the person. And that's what we're capable of doing now. That wasn't possible, I would say, or at least, very easy to do for most of our history. But now we have the tools to do it. We can make an educational experience for you based on who you are.
So other than ASU, can I put you on the spot and say, are there other universities in the United States that you really think are progressive and are really on the way to doing this?
Well, I would be hard pressed to say universities are. I would say the university system in New York under Nancy Zimpher is very progressive and really looking at all kinds of ways of delivering the reality of education, the life-changing reality of education. And it's interesting because I think a lot of the institutions that are less kind of highly placed, let's say, more practical in their work, are thinking about it in a more interesting way. That they're really looking at, because they make their living on people succeeding in life, right? That they give them the tools to actually make a living and change the circumstances of their life. So they're a lot more, in some ways, more tuned in to that problem. Whereas I think the kind of higher ranked institutions have somewhat insulation from that, because the people who are going there are richer and not, they're not so worried about making a living necessarily. They have a lot more resources to begin with, and they have a kind of flexibility and an ability to kind of move in the world that people at community college do not. And so I think those institutions are somehow more tuned in to the kind of pressing needs.
Okay.
And
Go ahead.
no, I was going to read a question, but you go ahead. I'm sorry. We have another couple of questions. So in terms of the anger out there being fear-based, how does mindfulness tie into your theory?
That's a great question. And it is really central to a daily practice of optimism. And I think it's important to acknowledge that design is a practice in the way that meditation is a practice. In that you can learn it to do it, but you really have to do it to learn it. And so that kind of mindfulness is very helpful in recovering your ability to sustain energy of optimism, to be able to kind of take a step back, breathe, and get a new kind of energy and kind of recover, because we are living through an onslaught like really has never happened in our lifetimes, and it's happened few times in our history. So the challenge is really intense. And just, I have to say that, I've been doing a series of talks for people in the live experience industry over the last 6 weeks. And, it is so demoralizing to see the curve going endlessly vertical, that it's like, we thought we had some hope of getting out of this sometime soon. And now we're looking at, months more of these conditions, and maybe more than that. And so it is hard to sustain an optimistic outlook under those conditions. But I argue that is our responsibility. That it's other people can complain. Our job is to maintain optimism.
So another question from the community is, if you could go back, what would you tell your 25-year-old self?
I would tell him, marry B.C. Williams, because that was a really good move. I would tell him, besides that, which I would start there, and then I would say, make the most of it. Right? Like you have opportunities every day. You have opportunities, they come and go. And, when I look back, I realized, there are some opportunities that I didn't understand. I didn't really grasp, who I was working with, or what the potential was, or, and it was years later, I now have the kind of luxury of being able to look back. It was years later I realized, gosh, that was really stupid of me. I could have made a lot more of that. So I think that it's really, in some ways, fact-based optimism helps you to make the most of it, helps you to see the opportunity when it presents itself, because it doesn't always present itself, or it may present itself in a very weird and kind of mysterious and almost hidden way. And the methodology of fact-based optimism, of really gathering the data, helps you to see it where it is.
And data right now is also in the news every day, whether it's the number of cases or the number of deaths, or who's controlled it better than somebody else, or the polls and the election. I mean, we have data coming at us from everywhere. And I think we would all agree that the challenge is knowing and understanding that data in and of itself coming from someone isn't perfect, that we really have to take it in and use our own analytical tool to decide where it fits. Is that fair?
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, David Byrne really, laid it out. Facts are crooked and facts are straight. Right? Like, facts don't do what you want them to. But I think that more than at any time in our history, there are people like Max Roser, who you can trust, right? Who you can trust to really get the data and show the data, and really show the pattern in the data. And that the work that they're doing at Our World in Data, is the work of angels. I mean, they are making accessible patterns that would otherwise be invisible to everyone, or to to almost everyone, be accessible to very few people. So today you can access the data in a way that, it just wasn't possible.
Right.
And so I think doing that as a kind of exercise of really, and starting with Max Roser, because he will link you to everything else that really matters. There are a few people in that world that are really wonderful, that take seriously the power of data and the importance of the truth.
Right. We're going to put that in chat, so everybody has a link to Max Roser and that, because again, he's not a household name that you hear in the news, or you hear CNN or MSNBC or Fox or anybody else in the alphabet soup of news quote, and put this kind of data front and center, because that's the kind of data that people would have a much easier time trusting, therefore feeling optimistic about.
Yeah.
Shelley, do we have one last question?
We do. Let's see. We had a couple of comments, actually, that if people are looking in the chat section, Catherine commented, there's so much focus on personalized medicine. Bruce is positing personalized education.
Yep.
And here's a question. Hello, I'm Marina, a teacher and an architect from Argentina. You said that not knowing is important to be free of mind. I was wondering, how do you use your intuition as a method?
That's a wonderful question. I protect that first experience. There's a concept in military practice called the fog of war, and that is, when you're in a battle, you're getting the best information you can, but it's really spotty because some of your people are getting killed and some of them are succeeding, and you can't really see what's going on. You have to piece it together by kind of scraps of information. And really great battlefield leaders can have an intuitive sense of what's really happening by listening to what they're getting. And that fog of war methodology is really important in design, that we, at the beginning, when you start that project, you're getting very piecemeal piece of information. That's a kind of treasured time, because you can have intuitive insights and exploration with that kind of degraded information that you wouldn't have if you had all the information, because you would get more and more information about what doesn't work. And often, I'm often in a situation where, I propose something and someone in the room will say, yeah, well, we did that 3 years ago and it didn't work. And I have to say, look, you didn't do it the way that we would do it. Right? It might sound similar, but you have to protect that kind of early exploration as part of a project work that could, really be inventive. And I have to admit that sometimes, very early in the project, I can kind of see the pathway that others don't see. And that comes in that kind of early stage. Does that make sense?
I see you're saying yes, it does, with thumbs up. Well, and that sadly brings us to 7 o'clock again. I don't know how this always happens, Bruce, because I feel like probably if we took a vote, everybody'd say, let's keep going, please. But I always make a commitment to stop on time. So I want to do that. This is the end of the 3-part series that we promised. And so, Bruce, I want to thank you. I've already told everybody that with any luck at all, somewhere again in 2020, we're going to continue with you because everybody wants to learn about this and spend this time doing it. It's been pretty unanimous every time we get off our Zoom collective conscience. So, and this is Shelley's and my way of taking that voice and amplifying the optimism and bringing people to each other in order to have this kind of optimism and exploration of what's possible. So thank you so much, Bruce. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Michaela. Thank you, Shelley. Really delightful.
Pleasure. Thank you, everybody. And please stay tuned next Monday at 6 o'clock for Eames Demetrius, the grandson of Charles and Ray Eames, and the discussion of his parallel universe called Chimeric Sphere. And you will want to tune into that and study a little bit before we get on the phone with him. Thank you so very much.
Most definitely.
Thank you. Take care. Good night, everybody.